So welcome back, everybody. I hope that everyone has had the chance to use the networking area of the platform and had the chance to meet and to chat with some of your fellow participants and hopefully make some new connections too. And don't worry, there's going to be plenty more opportunity for using that networking area and all the other interactive areas of the platform later on in the event. But for now, I am delighted that we're now ready to start our first panel of the conference. Now, the first panel is going to be focusing on leading the way and looking at 5G visions and early experiences across the APAC region. Now, I think if we look at the different regions around the world, then it is widely believed that Asia Pacific is leading the way when it comes to 5G rollout, and we're really looking forward to hearing from some of our expert speakers on their plans and also on these early experiences that we are seeing with 5G. So without further ado, I would now like to start the panel, and I would like to begin by welcoming to the stage Masanori Kondo, who is the Deputy Secretary General at the APT. Now, Masanori, hello there, welcome. And I know we've had a few issues with your video, but the main thing is your sound is working and your sound is loud and clear. So welcome, Masanori, and we're really looking forward to the panel. And I would now like to pass over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dan, very much, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. So let's start session one. As Dan briefly explained, we will focus on the 5G situation in this region, Asia Pacific region. And today we have 4 prominent speakers from different areas and expertise. So first, I'd like to invite Mr. Stuart Cook, Chair Global Spectrum Team, GSA, for his presentation, which will cover the overview of this region. So Stuart, you have a floor.
I think you're on mute, Stuart, sorry. Stuart, I think you're still on mute. Maybe try refreshing your browser if you can and come back in, and hopefully that will then work. What we can maybe do, I'm just going to bring Masanori back up. What we can maybe do, if it's okay, we will come back to Stuart's presentation and we'll get those sound issues sorted out. So Masanori, apologies, maybe I could ask you to maybe introduce our second speaker, yeah, okay. And then we can come back to Stuart shortly. So
yeah, good down. Thank you. So then, Ping, are you ready? So if that is the case, I'd like to invite the next speaker, Ping Li, who is working at the Bureau of Radio Regulation, MIT, China. So Ping, you have a floor.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Kondo. Can I begin now? Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and nice to meet you again. I'm Li Ping from MIT, China. I'm very pleased to attend your conference again. My topic today is about the latest frequency planning and the development of 5G in China. You can see from my slides. Next slide. Okay, I will introduce from 3 parts. First, I will introduce the overview of 5G in China, and then the latest progress we have made, and then the last one is about the future consideration. Scroll on. And first, we can see that now in the world, many countries have realized 5G commercial deployment, and China is one of them. And we can see that in 2019 June, China has issued the commercial license to 4 operators. And the fourth operator, that is the China Broadcasting Network, that is the newcomer, that is the fourth operator in China for IMT. And after that, China started the 5G deployment quickly. Just 1 year later, until last month of this year, we can see that great progress we have made. You can see the numbers on the slide, that more than 400,000 5G base stations have been deployed. And the number of 5G mobile phones connected to the mobile network has reached 66 million. So that is the progress we have made, and we know that the advances comes from the efforts of the related parties, including the administration, the IMT, and the satellite operators, the manufacturers, also the research agencies, and so on. So in order to achieve this progress, we have done a lot of preparations. Next, please. From the frequency allocation to the frequency planning for 5G policies. And next, we can see the regulation timeline before 2019. And since this work I have introduced in the last 2 conference meetings, so today I will mainly introduce the latest progress and the latest what we have done from last year. Next, please. And I will introduce what we have considered in the frequency band from the low band, medium band, and high band. First is the lower band below 3 gigahertz. We know that China has planned the amount of 618 megahertz of frequency band for Mpt before 2019. And this spectrum has been used to deploy 2G, 3G, and 4G network by 3 operators. And this year, with the transfer of broadcasting from analog to digital, some spectrum can be released. You can see on the slide that in March this year, China has replanned the frequency band of 700 megahertz from broadcasting service to mobile service. This is the same frequency plan or solutions as many countries in the world is 700 megahertz. And also the same year in May, China Broadcasting Network Corporation, the fourth operator in China, has got the frequency license of some of the above frequency band in the 700 megahertz. Next, please. And as for the lower band, another thing I want to mention is that NB-IoT and eMTC used for 5G mMTC applications. In order to improve the spectrum utilization, at the end of last year, we have issued the regulations on eMTC systems in 0 frequency band below 3 gigahertz. And also at the same time, related radio frequency technical and management requirements has been released. And this document will push forward the development of IoT in China. Next, please. And second, I will introduce the media band from 3 to 6 gigahertz for 5G. As for the C band, the media band we have issued for 5G in 2018. And the C band is also the key band in China to deploy 5G at the early stage. At the same time, we have reformed 2,600 megahertz frequency band used for LTE to 5G. And this reforming will greatly expand available frequency spectrum for 5G systems. Next, please. And with the acceleration of the 5G construction this year, we began to release more spectrum in the media band to deploy 5G. You can see early this year in January, we have issued the frequency band for trial license of the 4,900 to 4,960 megahertz. And 1 month later, in February, we have issued the frequency license of the 3.3 gigahertz to 3.4 gigahertz to deploy 5G in drones. And also, another important thing is that with the material of the 5G technology and the 5G equipment, in June this year, the radio frequency technical requirements of the 5G equipment in low media frequency band were released. And these bands including all the 5G frequency band we have issued. So this document will accelerate the deployment of 5G base stations in the future. So next, please. The third one is about the high band, that is the millimeter wave band. Following the results of WRC-19, we were considered to identify total or part of the millimeter wave band for Mpt in the revision of the Chinese radio frequency allocation this year. And also in the future, we will consider to launch 5G frequency planning of the millimeter wave frequency band based on the industry demand. Next, please. And besides the frequency planning, we know that the 5G policies are also the same important for 5G deployment. We can see on this slide that since 2018, we have issued a lot of frequency 5G policies from the 5G spectrum phase to the guidance and coordinations of interferences of 5G stations. So that is very important. And this year, we have issued a very important document. Next, please. We have issued a very important document that is will give the specific guidance for the interference coordination during the 5G deployment. And this document clarifies the responsibilities of the relevant department, such as the administration, the operators, Mpt operator and the satellite operator, and so on. And also, this document gives the proposed protection distance and the coordination distance for 5G stations. And also, this document established the principles of the coordination is very important for the actual deployment of 5G in the future. So the last one, next please. I will introduce our future consideration for 5G frequency planning. First is that within the framework of ITU, we were considered to develop 5G frequency plan, including the low band frequency plan. We were reforming the lower band for 5G, and also maybe we will release more media band for 5G, and also we were considered to make the millimeter wave band for 5G. Second is that we will continue to carry out compatibility research of relevant bands under the agenda item 1.2 of WRC 2623. And in the future, we will consider the compatibility issues of the 6 gigahertz to 7 gigahertz band. The last one is that we will push forward the research on 5G dedicated frequency for industrial internet. Next, we will consider the dedicated frequency in 5G technology. And this year we will carry out some trial research on the 5G dedicated frequency band. And also we look forward to communicating and cooperating with other countries in this issue, and then to boost the development of 5G in the future. So that is all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
For your presentation, and you may have a question to ask, but since we have a question, a Q&A session after the fourth presentation, please keep it until then. So next, since Stuart is back, so I'd like to once again briefly introduce Mr. Stuart Cook, Chair Global Spectrum Team, GSA. Now, Stuart, you have the floor.
Thank you. You know, this, for me, this is a really exciting time to be involved in the wireless industry and the mobile broadband industry. You know, we've done the standardization, the research and development, we've had the Spectrum World Radio conferences, the technical regulations are in place, and now we've got some of those leading countries and the leading operators within those countries are now beginning to deploy 5G. And for me, that's the exciting part, where all of that hard work now leads to deployments and usage and rollout of 5G. If we could go to the next slide, please. And so as GSA, we're the vendor-led industry association. We're really pleased to be a part of that 5G development. We're here to support the 3GPP ecosystem. We've been around for quite some time, and we have a lot of information on our websites in terms of data and reports and technical reports. So please do take a look at that. Regulators are members of the GSA, and that gives them access to a lot of information. If we could go through to the next slide, please. One of the things in the GSA is we have a spectrum group and a global spectrum group, and I'm honoured to be the chair of that for the next cycle up until the World Radio Conference in 23. And the way we organise ourselves is we break ourselves down into regional teams and global teams, and we have a really active spectrum team in this region, and Hung Jin from Samsung is the chair of the GSA APT group, and for the next few years, and for those that know, Hung Jin is very active in the regulatory world and was very active in the run-up to the last World Radio Conference. Boya from Huawei will take over that chair role in the run-up to the conference in a few years' time. And then we have teams based in looking at India and ASEAN, and Alex from looks at towards the Australia and New Zealand technical regulation. So we have a lot of activity, but also Harkin leads our ITU group, and Dow leads our marketing group. So we have a lot of leadership within the GSA in this region. But we don't do that, of course, on our own. We have to cooperate with other regional organizations such as the GSMA, COIA, CAICT, and lots of other organizations with hard to pronounce acronyms. So that's the spectrum group within the GSA. If we could go through to the next slide, please. And you know, for me, before we talk about the 5G in detail, it's for me often useful to talk about why we're doing this, and to take a step back and a step up, if you like. And I go back to the ITU's vision 20 or 30 years ago, and for me it's a really powerful vision. It was to connect everyone wirelessly, and I still think that's valid. You know, we've helped enable 7 billion people so far to be wirelessly connected, and that's a tremendous success story. We've got a long way to go to connect a further 1 billion people. There are challenges there, but we're working on that. And not only now with everyone, but with IMT 2020 and 5G, we've got to connect everything. So everyone and everything we're working to wirelessly connect. And if we could go through to the next slide, please. How do we do that? So as we know, it's a Spectrum conference, right? And so Spectrum is a key enabler for 5G. It sounds obvious, but gone are the days when we have a single frequency band because of the spectrum resource scarcity and because of the additional wideband spectrum channels we need to support 5G and the marketplace and the services. We target a range of frequency bands, the low, the mid, and the high bands. And by having access to all three ranges, that enables an operator and a user to deliver the full 5G experience. And so 600 and 700 megahertz as examples, low bands, great coverage layer, both outside of the cities, but also within the cities, filling in those hard to reach places, basements, deep indoor penetration. A lot of activity globally on licensing and preparing for licensing in mid bands, the 3.3 to 4.2, the 4.5 to 5 gigahertz as examples, but also 2.3 and 2.6, etc. You know, a lot of focus and emphasis on mid bands, and it provides a great capacity and coverage layer deployment. But let's not forget also the millimeter waves, the high bands, the 26, the 28, the 40 gigahertz, etc. You know, that ultra experience layer, hotspots, fixed wireless access, industrial use, etc. So it's a combination of the low, the mid, and the high bands. Next slide, please. And so what is going on in terms of those mid-band ranges? And we pick on one example here, the C-band, and we look at what's going on in the rest of the world. And don't worry, I'm not going to go through this in excruciating detail, but from a GSA point of view, what's good is red. So that means that the administration, the government have been through the consultation process and the licenses have been assigned, and the operators can now begin to deploy 5G in the mid-band, the C-band spectrum. A lot of activity, a lot of red in Europe and the Americas and the Middle East and Africa. And I think if we had this presentation in a year's time, you would see a lot more red here. So the blue is where we're consulting and the red is where it's been licensed and assigned. So a lot of momentum here in C-band as a mid-band example. But what about, next slide please, what about the Asia Pacific? Again, great news here, a lot of red, a lot of C-band has already been assigned and a lot of the administrations are now consulting and planning for the assignment of mid-band. And this is where a major focus is for 5G and those initial deployments. So our recommendation is, if you haven't yet managed to license Spectrum to enable 5G to be deployed in these bands, is we would encourage administrations to license this year, or if that's not possible, then next year, so that everybody can take advantage of 5G. If we could go through to the next slide, please. So what about the high band, the millimeter wave bands? We give two examples here, the 26 and the 28 gigahertz. And if you look at the slide on the left, that's Europe, slightly behind in terms of the C-band deployments. And so in Europe, we have a lot of consultations going on at the moment. We have some initial deployments at 26 gigahertz, but a lot of consultations going on. And I've had, I think, 3 consultations past my desk this last week in terms of Europe and its plans for 26. And so if you look at the top right there, the USA is Verizon Wireless at 28 gigahertz, a pioneer in terms of millimeter wave deployments. And the US government recently licensed and auctioned 26 or parts of 26 to provide the option for 5G there. So a lot of momentum now building in the Americas. Next slide, please. But the great news here, of course, is at 26 and 28, that range of spectrum, a lot of red here, and we anticipate more and more administrations taking a focus on millimeter wave over the next 1 to 2 years. And of course, you have to coexist with the satellite services, but administration's trying to make some of that range 24.25 to 29.5 available for 5G, if we could move forward. And so, you know, that's the examples of the C-band and the 26 and 28 gigahertz. But what about those initial deployments I was talking about earlier? And if you look at some of the numbers, and we've taken China and Japan and Korea as examples, that are, of course, other countries that have licensed and beginning deployments. But if we take these 3 countries just as examples, it's quite, for me, quite staggering the numbers involved here. And so, you know, if you look at Japan, for example, and one of the operators, there are of course other operators there, but from the financial plans at Docomo, they plan to invest $10 billion in their 5G build out, and which is really impressive over the next 4 years. If you look at, could you, bring the slides up. If you could look at Japan, in terms of 20,000 base stations and 20 million 5G subscribers for one operator. And we've heard previously, you know, the numbers in China are just staggering. 800,000 base stations by the end of this year is the plan. I think we heard we're at 400,000 already. And then just look at the Korea numbers. So 25 gigabytes per month per 5G subscriber, which is, you know, incredible. 10% of the population, 115,000 base stations. So we have the largest deployment. We have the first combined mid and high band deployment, and we have the first 5G deployment. 3 countries as examples. Next slide, please. And so, you know, as an industry association, we recommend and we advocate that it's that combination of spectrum from low, mid and high bands that enables that real 5G experience. And as you can see from the 3 examples, we've moved from that design phase into the implementation and rollout phase. And examples from China and Japan and Korea, and there are others, but in very, very impressive and very fast and very ubiquitous rollouts. And so we would encourage everybody to be read by next year in terms of those charts, and those charts are available on the GSA website. But please license 5G this year, and if that's not possible, then next year. And in terms of future topics, then I think, Dan, that you know you're going to be busy looking at various topics over the coming year or so, but fixed wireless access would be an interesting, both at mid band and high band. That's an interesting use case that's gaining momentum. 5G and unlicensed spectrum, NRU, new radio unlicensed, is another interesting topic. And then we have industry applications and deployments, a lot of discussion on the business models and the licensing models. Automotive, bringing the automotive ecosystem together with the 3GPP ecosystem. And the same with the broadcast industry. You know, is there a way to grow the ecosystem for both broadcasters and mobile operators, etc.? And finally, in terms of spectrum, a number of the administrations have already licensed the initial mid-band spectrum. And so a lot of discussion now is beginning to happen on additional mid-band spectrum. Where is that additional mid-band spectrum going to come from to support additional growth in the latter part of this decade? Planning for success. Is it 3.8 to 4.2? Is it 4 to 5? Is it the upper 6 gigahertz, etc., etc.? A lot of those discussions are beginning to take place. So it's happening, it's here. And so we're trying to connect everyone and everything, and let's work together to try and get that 5G vision realized. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Stuart. I think his presentation gives us overview and provides our current standing position through the comparison across regions. Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to invite Kun Protompom and Kun Tithantam from NBTC Thailand for their presentation.
Okay, good afternoon from Thailand to you all. I would like to first thank for inviting me to be the part of this panel on very important topics. This forum is a great opportunity for us to exchange our views and ideas on dealing with the 5G and way forward. Next slide, please. In the world of 5G, strengthening the value of our fifth generation network is crucial for a small country like Thailand, and it needs to be done so that our network remains robust and efficient, and fostering an ecosystem conducive to innovation and competition. The nature of 5G service requires that we emphasize on strengthening our value added of our telecommunication networks. Therefore, transformation toward 5G ecosystem couldn't be effort of individual firm alone. We need to focus on creating the 5G ecosystem with active collaboration from a wide range of stakeholders. We are at the important juncture in our generation networks. Now it's time to look into the future and imagine what the digital platform will look like from now. Next slide, please. Let me speak from the perspective of emerging market telecommunication regulator. Within the 5G landscape, how MPTC accelerating the 5G ecosystem development. Today, I and my colleague Dr. Pathomphong will highlight the MPTC initiative. For the first part, I will highlight our policy to promote the 5G infrastructure. And the second part, Pathomphong will share initiative to promote the development of digital platform and use case in vertical sector. Next slide, please. Okay. The first initiative I would like to highlight is the Mpt Spectrum Roadmap. MPTC has a policy objective to improve the wireless infrastructure and encourage a new telecommunication service. The goal corresponds to the government scheme for driving the digital economy. In 2019, MPTC Commissioner has announced the 5-year Mpt Spectrum Roadmap as a guideline for stakeholders. The Mpt Spectrum Roadmap highlights the initial timeframe for planning and preparation of Mpt Spectrum auction. For the 5G first wave, 700 MHz, 1800 MHz, 26 MHz, and 26 GHz put up for auction on the last February. We were successful in auctioning process and awarded the license to the mobile operators. For the second phase of the roadmap, we set up the working group responsible for preparing to release 3.5 spectrum. The roadmap for releasing 3.5 consists of 3 stages. Next slide, please. Planning and decision, implementation, and award system. The working group has to review the current use in extended C-band, assess potential of coexistence between MTS and satellite service, and also conduct the cost-benefit analysis. The result will be the key issue for decision-making. The second multi-band spectrum auction batch will be consist of 3.5, 1800, and 28 GHz. When we look back to the consultation period, analysts had expected previously that Thailand mobile operator would need more time before investing in a new generation network, since it spent $1 billion in 2015 on 4G license. The demand for ultra-fast network has also expected to remain thin, making a rapid deployment of 5G very unlikely. However, the spread of coronavirus infection has quickly reversed this earlier prediction. It generates a new range of telecom service needs. The pandemic has pushed demand for telemedicine and robots that operate in hospitals, and finally accelerating the commercial of 5G. Next slide, please. The second initiative I will highlight is our initiative to enabling a 5G infrastructure development. MPTC has a goal to promote infrastructure development and improve the quality of service. Next, please. The previous multi-band spectrum auction, we setting incentive term of payment and obligation for MNO to speed up 5G network rollout in smart city and also Eastern Economic Corridor. Next, please. Next slide, please. Next, please. Okay. The Eastern Economic Corridor is a pilot project for economic development of Thailand Eastern Seaboard. MPTC also support for 5G infrastructure rollout by setting up the criteria for MNO to sharing facility and facilitate easier site acquisition and process. The obligation and commitments are result of our shared vision and collaborative effort undertaken by all stakeholders. Since the 5G multi-band spectrum auction was held in the last February, we have a remarkable progress in upgrading infrastructure. Thailand major telecom operator deployment of fifth generation technology make Thailand the first country in 10 member association of Southeast Asian nations to have a commercial of 5G service. The two winner mobile operators are listening to deploy the 5G networks. For the next part, I would like to invite Thongpong to share our initiative to promote the development of digital platform and use case in vertical sector, please.
Yes, thank you. And the next slide, please. Yes, my colleagues Titan already shared about the spectrum that the regulator prepared for the 5G or the fifth generation mobile network. And in my session, I will share about the world trend and also how we prepare for the use cases, because it is the first time that Thailand turned to be the early adopter for the mobile technology. In terms of the CPE or customer premise equipment, now the handset is ready about 95 models, and other devices is ready. The number saying as the device is ready about 40 models. And for use cases, now as we all know, there's use cases that being used for the 5G are IoT sensors, AR, VR, and also smart city. Next slide, please. And as we know, for the 5G at the global level, we can see quite many countries. Right now, 41 countries implement 5G network in commercial and include Thailand too. And next slide, please. And for the use cases, we are, as I mentioned, we are at this. Please back to the previous one. Yes, we are at the early stage of the 5G development in Thailand, and I think in the world too. We try to see the opportunity in the vertical industry, and what we found, at least there are 3 vertical industry that will be implemented in Thailand. The first one is, could you go back to the previous one? Yeah, there would be 3 use cases, 5G use cases in Thailand. The first one is the 5G in the healthcare industry. The second one would be in the manufacturing, and the last one is in agriculture. The first one that I would like to talk about is the smart hospital. And now we are in the initial stage that we're talking with some hospitals in Thailand that they would like to introduce the smart hospital in their hospitals. And the stage that we that they would like to use for the 5G in the hospital, they say there would be 3 stages for using of 5G in the hospital. The first one is pre-hospital. It means the data that the patients they need to collect data for patients. For example, the patient can use IoT wearable device to collect their personal data about sleep, about exercise. And when they come to the hospital could use the data, the existing data, like the X-ray filming, and also some others healthcare data for AI analysis. And AI can use for the analytic and also consultation. And the hospitals in Thailand, they plan to use the 5G for the inter-hospital as well, because they think that the 5G remote consultant and remote diagnosis would be the future for the smart hospital in Thailand as well. For the next use case is the next case, the smart manufacturing. And for the factory right now is just is now in Thailand is the semi-automation. And in Thailand, we're talking with now the EEC Commission and also the BOI. Perhaps the factory, they would like to use this opportunity to use the 5G technology to turn themselves to be fully automated factory. And in terms of technology, they could use the IoT again, and also sensors, robotics, and AR, VR to use in their operation, in their inventory, and also in their analysis and monitoring. And they could use the 5G together with data and analytics to predict and to forecast demand and also forecast the supply as well. The last one that I would like to mention for the use cases in potential use cases in Thailand is the smart agriculture. Thailand used to be the agricultural nation, and now, I mean, not so many of population are being in the agricultural business. But I think the 5G can be implemented in agriculture and can promote the productivity and also improve the quality of the product for the agriculture. And it's quite the same for the technology. We're going to use the IoT, and also maybe more than that, we can use drone. And of course, we have to use the data that we collect from the sensors, from the soil, from the water, and also from the weather forecast or anything like that. And the ultimate goal of the smart agriculture is we would like to implement the precision agriculture that would make our agricultural product is more valuable. And the last one that I would like to mention is the government. Next slide, please. The government would need to play a big role in terms of promoting the 5G. And as I mentioned earlier, that Thailand, we never have experience on being an early adopter yet. And Thai government and also, I mean, us as a regulator need to do some more work in terms of industry promotion. The package that we think would be appropriate to implement, there would be 4 packages here. We would need to promote infrastructure sharing. As we all know, the 5G technology is the investment will be huge because the operator need to implement new investment, and the fiber tax need also to implement as well, because I mean with the 5G wireless premise, but they would need also the fiber to connect the towers together anyway. So fiber tax need to be implemented as well to make the operators as well as the vertical industry save a bit of money when they invest in the fiber. And the next one is the investment incentive. This one related to the board of investment, that we have another commission that could give the incentive to the factory and also telcos to make them invest in very high value and new S-curve product. And last but not least, all the government agencies needs to ease related regulations in order to promote the 5G in the countries. Yes, it's all of our presentation. Yeah, the question are welcome. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, you both. Kopun Club. I think their presentation illustrates what are the thought of policymakers and how they are handling and identified challenges. So finally, of course, last but not least, we'd like to invite the 4th presenter, Stefan Zil, CEO of Colliago. So Stefan, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm going to talk to you about spectrum pricing and how spectrum pricing might affect the deployment of 5G. Next slide, please. There appears to be a consensus, whichever country we are looking at, whichever region, that 5G is important, and there's a race on to deploy or get 5G deployed in their respective countries. And here are a couple of statements from the European Commission and also one from the IT minister in Bangladesh. So they'd like to be a winner in the 5G race. Next slide, please. Now, 5G from a spectrum perspective is a key driver in increased need for spectrum. And the two things, when we look at the IMT 2020 requirements for 5G, is really the user experience data rate of 100 megabits. That's a 10-fold increase compared to LTE Advanced. And the area traffic capacity, so that is the ability to serve hotspots, and there's a 100-fold increase to 10 megabits per square meter. Next slide, please. So the spectrum resources available to operators are the legacy bands, and I'm looking here at the typical Asian countries. We might have 700, 850, and 900, and the lower mid bands. And then we have the upper mid bands, which are really proper to 5G only. So this is where you don't have any legacy technology. This is the C-band, and then perhaps also the 6 gigahertz band to be discussed as WRC23. And then we have the millimeter wave or high bands, where there's plenty of spectrum available. Now, the high bands are not suitable for wide area coverage. They are suitable to reach the area traffic capacity goal of 5G, whereas the upper mid bands, those are the ones that are necessary to achieve the user experience data rate of 100 megabits. Next slide, please. So this means operators have to acquire a lot of spectrum over the next few years and also make the investment to light up the spectrum in base stations as well as fiber backhaul. So, and as was already mentioned, an enormous amount of investment has to flow in to make 5G a reality. Next slide, please. So we have a lot of investment. Why? Because there's, of course, a huge traffic growth anticipated, 25 to 30% a year. On the other hand, when we look at the revenue of mobile operators, it's not really increasing. So the consumer is the winner and should be. But of course, this makes the business case for 5G extremely challenging. Next slide, please. And this is really summarized here by an article in the Financial Times from December 2019. Telecoms has been the worst performing sectors for investors over the past 5 years. And I tell you what, it's not looking good for the future. Investment in telecoms really sucks. I really wouldn't put my dollar there. And that is a problem for 5G. Next slide, please. To achieve a return on investment, there must be a profit. And the return on investment is nothing else but profit divided by capital employed. And of course, capital employed is increasing because there's investment in network. And of course, in many countries, substantial license fees are being extracted from the operators, spectrum license fees. Next slide, please. In Europe, this issue of spectrum license fees really came to the fore, and the European Commission became concerned that it might affect the deployment of 5G because different countries have different policies when it comes to spectrum license fees. So they asked Colliago to study 13 countries to assess the extent as to how policymakers extract spectrum license fees from operators, which of course is then not available to invest in the network. Next slide, please. So the model we developed is we looked at every country, we took at, okay, what was the upfront license fees paid for spectrum, and we converted that into an annualized equivalent using an annuity formula. We added any upfront fees, and that gave us the annualized cost of spectrum, and we simply calculated annualized cost of spectrum as a percentage of revenue. Next slide, please. And here's the result. So you can see, and this is a homogeneous area, this is the European Union, but we can see the annualized cost of spectrum varies from a staggering 17% of revenue to 1% in places like Latvia and Finland, and also low amounts in Estonia. So as you can see, there's a very wide range. Of course, there are only 13 data points, so it's pointless to carry out statistical analysis on this, but we can carry out some anecdotal analysis and look at, for example, Finland, which extracts only 1% in terms of spectrum license fees. Let's have the next slide, please. So what we can see here in Finland is, on the right-hand side, I present a little chart which shows the capacity potential to handle increased data demand. So that's the, if you will, the free capacity available for 5G. And you can see out of the 4 best networks in the world, 3 are in Finland. Here's a statement from the Finnish regulators. Mobile data usage grew to 34 gigabytes per Fin per month during the first half of 2019, a growth rate of 21%. And by comparison, the European average is only 8.2 gigabytes. So you could argue that the Finnish people get 4 times as much use or as much value or benefit out of the network compared to the European average. And this is what a successful spectrum management policy looks like. Next slide, please. So sadly, we talked about the great success in the region, in the APAC region, notably Japan, Korea, China. I think we might also add Singapore and perhaps Australia and New Zealand into that. But there are many laggards, and in particular, when we look at India and Bangladesh, sadly, the attempt to extract excessive spectrum license fee means that spectrum that could be available for 5G, it's available, it's not used. So it does not serve the population, it does not help the country to develop or deploy 5G. And indeed, in India, policy led to bankruptcy amongst operators, and state-owned operators have to be propped up with additional loan guarantees. Bangladesh, similar picture, spectrum unassigned, and indeed the state-owned operator, because spectrum prices were so high, they didn't even bother to turn up at the last auction. So really the message there to regulators or policymakers is spectrum pricing could really break the 5G momentum. Next slide, please. So Coliago is happy to share this report with you. Send me an email and I will also send you the tool to assess the spectrum pricing in your country. It's simple to use. Simply send an email to the address stated on the first page of this presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. It's very interesting. It could be one of the possible approaches when it comes to spectrum pricing based on this kind of empirical analysis. So here we got several questions from the audience, but before I open the floor to audience, I think, Dan, we do show the questionnaires to the audience now, or?
Hi, Masuo. Yes, the audience polls have been live, so we'll be bringing the results up shortly. So in about 5 minutes or so, we'll bring those results up. So people have been voting, and we'll have those results very shortly. So yeah, we're just calculating the results from the polls now.
Okay, thank you very much. Then while we are waiting, and before we open the questionnaire to the audience, I have several questions, but just focus one question from my side. So my question is that, as Stefan mentioned, mobile network operators, they need to increase profit. And in order to do that, you need to consider possible ways that don't just depend on volume of traffic. So, what kind of measures they can take in order to increase the profit. So if that is the case, then I think a case study, as NBTC like a presentation mentioned, are very important. So my question is this. In terms of feasibility, let's say, and also time frame, short term or mid term or long term, what could be the possible use cases for mobile operators to implement, as I said, let's say in short term or mid term or long term? So anyone from speakers or panelists? Okay, so Stefan, please.
Yeah, I think the most important use case for 5G is to reduce the cost per bit, which is data volumes generated by smartphone users. So that's what's driving things over the next 3 years. And in order to do that, each operator requires at least 100 megahertz of new spectrum, TDD spectrum, for example, in the C-band, or to deploy 100 megahertz wide radio. And that is the only way in which affordable 5G can be delivered to populations.
Okay, thank you. Is anyone else? Any comments? Okay, then now we know the outcome of the polls. Then I think there are 3 questions. First one is, which region do you think is leading the way when it comes to 5G rollout? And the second one is, can operators deliver the requirements of 5G without an additional 100 megahertz of mid-band spectrum per operator? And the third one is, what do you see as the dominant IMT technology over the next 5 to 10 years? So first question is, maybe depends on how you observe. Then maybe I would invite our panelists' opinion or observation for the second one and the third one. And for the, let's see, I have outcome of a poll result. Yes, the third question. Maybe I will ask policymakers, so Thailand and China, NBTC and MIICT. Once again, the result of this question is 4G will remain the dominant technology, 10%. Then 5G will become dominant within 5 years, 28%. And 4G initially, but 5G will take over in 5 to 10 years, 62%. So based on this outcome, how do you observe, or how do you evaluate, or what do you think about this outcome? Just your personal observation. So maybe first, Madam Pim.
Okay, can you hear?
Yes.
As for the question, and 4G or 5G will be dominant within 5 years or maybe more longer. From my point of view, I think this results were based on the construction or deployment of 5G. At this time, I think it's only the early stage of 5G, and whether it how it will development were based on the various 5G applications, and maybe in the future the 5G industry applications. So I think if we be optimistically, I think my answer is maybe 5G will become dominant within 5 years. I think that is be optimistically to see this issue, and but I think a different country has different situations, and if 4G can meet the customers' demand now, and maybe 5G will can have more industry applications later. So maybe I think the result 3 is okay. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pin. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Do you have a comment? Yes, please.
Yes. Thank you for the question. I think, the adoption of 5G is fast or is slow. I think there are at least 2 factors. The first factor is about CPE ready. If the handsets or the devices is, number of model. There are a number of models is ready for 5G, and the cost of adoption is cheaper. People would go for 5G, and the mobile operator will move from 4G to 5G as well. But I think 5 years adoption of 5G is quite challenging for the country of Thailand, because in terms of the devices now is quite expensive, and the affordable model is not many. There are not many models to adopt for the user. And the second factor is about the use cases. For Thailand, as I mentioned before, we've been asked. We asked to the vertical industry, do you want to use the 5G services or 5G technology? And some industries said they really don't know 5G could use for what application. So it means the role of the regulator and also the government need to promote more of the use of the 5G if we would like to see 5G to turn the country to turn the country to the 5G country. That is my personal opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Prantapon. And then I come back to the second question. Can operators deliver the requirements of 5G without an additional 500 megahertz of mid-band spectrum per operator? So the answer is yes is 42% and no is 58%. Quite almost so 40 to 60. So is there any comment? Maybe I would like to invite Stuart.
Thank you. So as a vendor industry organization, we recommend 80 to 100 megahertz of contiguous spectrum per network or per operator in the mid-band. And the reason is, as Stefan said earlier on, it's not just the cost per bit, but it's the services and the capacity and the differentiation that you can offer. And that is really important. And based on our experience so far, many of the administrations have tried to achieve that wide contiguous arrangements per network, per operator. And of course, in some countries, there are other radio users that constrain that, and there are policy issues that means perhaps some countries can't make all of that spectrum available. So if that is the case, then it's better to go with making some spectrum available to enable 5G rather than no spectrum available. So I think it boils down to a policy issue as well. But from our experience, these wideband channels are being made available broadly throughout the world. And then, as I said, the low band spectrum, wider channels, not as wide as 80, of course, but we do need some 10, 20 megahertz there for 5G, and then millimeter wave wideband channels again are required. That's our recommendation.
Okay, thank you, Stuart, for your observation and comments. Then you may be interested in the result of first question. Which region do you think is leading the way when it comes to 5G rollout? The answer, 78% Asia Pacific. Congratulations. And US 10%, Europe 10%, other 2%, and that's all. That's a result. So while we are doing this, questions are coming in. So let me manage them. First, maybe Madam Pin, first question I'd like to ask you. The question is, are operators allowed to operate 5G on existing 4G bands like FDD 1800, FDD 2100, and TDD 2300? So that is the question.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Kanto. For this question, now in China, the 5G cannot operate on the existing 5G frequency bands, except the frequency bands we have reformed and agreed, such as 2.6 gigahertz. And but just I have introduced in my presentation that in the future we will consider to reform more 4G or other lower band frequency bands for 5G, but it will depend on the operator's demands, and also it depends on the compatibility research. Since 4G and 5G are two different systems, so we should a lot of things to research. So that is for the question. And this frequency band we will consider in the future, but now it cannot. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bin. So next question is this. Since the frequencies used by 5G, C and beyond Ka bands are higher than 3G, 4G, the coverage of 5G BTS will be significantly narrower than 3G, 4G. Then the cost to deploy 5G in big countries will be higher than the time it took. It will also significantly longer to implement across the countries. Is this correct? So basically the question is whether this understanding is correct or not. So maybe I would like to ask Stuart to answer this question.
Thank you. So I think it's important to remember that we're at the very initial phase of 5G deployments, and the rollouts are beginning to happen. And so, as I said, a lot of focus is around the mid bands, the C band, for example, and also some momentum around the millimeter wave bands are building. And as the question said, you know, as you go up in frequency, the range decreases. There are techniques, of course, adaptive antenna solutions, etc., that improve the coverage. You can maybe use some of the lower frequencies. And so as we get past the initial rollouts, I think a lot of focus will turn to how do you improve the coverage and how do you make reuse of some of the lower frequencies. So for example, the 2.3, the 2.6, the 700 megahertz, so that you can improve the coverage and complement your mid and your high bands. So to improve that overall coverage and capacity. And I think it's related to the other question about LTE and 5G. You know, they both need to coexist for quite some time to enable that contiguous coverage as 5G is rolled out. So I think it's a timing and also a spectrum policy in terms of making some of the lower spectrum available.
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Comments?
Yes, Stefan, you have comments?
Yes, I just want to say that, of course, 5G has been specified for all frequency bands. So, and indeed, equipment is available with dynamic spectrum sharing to run 4G and 5G in the same band. So, for example, operators who are putting in the 700 megahertz now, they deploy equipment which is both 4G and 5G capable. And the transition is really not the hard refarming we are used to from going from 3G to 4G or 2G to 3G, but it's really very much smoother. And so there are coverage bands available, such as the 700, and indeed you'll see that in the US implementation of 5G has been in 850 megahertz to provide coverage. We then have the mid bands to provide the capacity in cities to provide that 100 megabits user experience data rate. And the millimeter wave or high band is really only there to cater for the very dense traffic environments and achieve the 10 megabits per square meter area traffic capacity goal of 5G. So of course, you would never use millimeter wave to cover a country.
Okay, thank you, Stefan. Still, questions are coming in, so let's go on. So next question is to NBTC Thailand. The question is, for Thailand, is 5G spectrum only being allocated directly to the main MNOs, or also directly or locally to other niche providers for verticals? So that's the question. So,
Yes. Yes. Actually, I mean, when we plan for the less than auction that occurred this year, our first plan was that we want the vertical industry to come and buy the spectrum themselves as well. But when we organize the public consultation, the vertical industry say perhaps it would be appropriate to let sell the spectrum to the MNO, and then they would rent the spectrum or the capacity from the MNO. Then our initial plan is dropped. But we'll see if the vertical industry they got an interest in buying the direct spectrum from us. That's also possible. But from now on, because of there's no interest from the vertical industries, that's why we sell to the MNO.
Okay, thank you very much. So next question is interesting but difficult to answer. So the question is this: in terms of commercial deployment for 5G, which is more prominent, MM wave or C band? So maybe not policymakers, but Stefan?
Yeah, it depends on the region and spectrum availability. For example, if we look at the US, where millimeter wave was really the driver for 5G, that was because there wasn't really any C-band available. They're now only gearing up to the auction. So there was a lack of mid-band spectrum, and they couldn't do much. So it was, in fact, millimeter wave. And then came the 600 megahertz. They had the spectrum auction, and that was available. So it very much depends on how spectrum is being made available. If you look at Finland, where the policy is to make as much spectrum available as cheaply as possible and as quickly as possible, we really seeing 5G introduced across a number of bands to provide coverage and as well as capacity where needed. And I think in this context, I just like to perhaps, we like to remind ourselves that we shouldn't really talk about 5G spectrum, because best practice from a regulatory perspective is technology and neutral spectrum licenses, technology and service neutral, by the way. And the introduction of technology should really be left to the operators to meet market demand. So I don't think it is something the regulators should say when things should happen at a certain time.
Okay, thank you. Next question is also maybe I would like to ask Stefan, because the question is about cost per bandwidth of frequency. So the question is, it was said that the operators should acquire at least 100 megahertz contiguous bandwidths in the mid-band. Is there any estimated increment of cost per gigabit for acquiring less than 100 megahertz bandwidths for 5G?
Yes, in fact, I have that information. So you can simply look at a cost index. The issue is this: an operator who has, let's say, only 20 megahertz in the C-band has to buy a C-band radio, install it, the antenna and everything to make use of that spectrum. But the cost of that radio, the installation and so on, is exactly the same regardless on how much spectrum is being used on that radio. The incremental cost of, say, using an extra 10 megahertz is marginal, perhaps in the order of 3.5% of total cost of ownership. So you can see that an operator who deploys 100 megahertz in a C-band radio has roughly half the cost compared to an operator who only has 50 megahertz available. And to the extent that costs one way or another, there must be passed on to the user in form of prices. This issue of bringing down the cost is particularly relevant for countries where affordability is an issue. And of course, there are many countries in the APAC region where affordability is an issue, and hence where the 100 megahertz assignment per operator is most needed. And Indonesia, by the way, is one of them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your comments. And now it's almost time. And I think in Indonesian time, 3:30. And I was asked to finish the session. So let me pick up the last question. This question is also wide, and there could be many different ways to answer. The question is this: a question regarding industrial use cases. Do you think spectrum management needs to evolve to facilitate the development of these applications? If so, in what way? Or should governments and regulators simply focus on releasing spectrum in the quickest way possible to the highest bidders? So this is an open question. Any comments or observations? Yes, Stuart.
So I think the industrial use case and how to license that and make that spectrum available to support that use case is a really hot topic, right? So there are lots of discussions around the world on how to do that. You know, it's clear to me, it's clear that we need to have mobile network operators very prominently in 5G to provide the coverage and the capacity and get the ecosystem working, the infrastructure, the chipsets, the devices. And all that then feeds down into benefiting the local area type approach, if that's what the administration decides to do. So there are a number of ways to enable that industrial type deployment, aren't there? The mobile operator can serve that. It could use the mobile operator's spectrum. It could be assigned locally. So all sorts of different combinations. But for example, in one country in Europe, for example, 3.8 to 4.2 has been made available for local area use, but there's a lack of chipsets and devices at the moment. So that's why that combination of operators, as well as if the administration decides to make some spectrum available for local area, it is really important. So it's not just the licensing, it's the ecosystem behind that needs to be considered. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So any other quick observation, comments?
Yeah. I would also say this, 5G is designed to cater for verticals because network slicing is a feature of 5G. So from that perspective, it's far more efficient to assign the spectrum to mobile operators who can then offer a network slice to these specific verticals as and when needed with the required bandwidth, latency, and so on. And of course, it also avoids for verticals, let's say a manufacturer of T-shirts or something, why would they want to run a very, very complicated telecommunication infrastructure inside their factory? It's simply not cost effective.
Okay, thank you very much. So with that, I'd like to conclude this session. And once again, thank you very much, Stuart, Pin, Kumpratopon, and Stefan. I think the audience are very much satisfied what you discussed and presented, and I can hear their applauding. So thank you very much once again, and back to them.
Thank you very much, Kondo-san. I would also like to add my thanks to all of our panelists and, of course, to Kondo-san for that session. And I would also like to say a big thank you to all of you out there in the audience for your questions. I think we got through a good number of those. I know there were a few that we didn't get to in time, but we got through a lot of those. So thank you all very much. And I think I was just having a look now at the numbers for that session, and I know there's more than 300 of you out there watching on the platform. So really do appreciate you all getting involved. And as I said, thank you for your questions as well. So we now have a short break. We have around about 35-minute break. So feel free to go off to make yourself a cup of tea or to maybe catch up on emails. And then we are back for the next session here again on the main stage in around about 35 minutes now. So at 4 o'clock Indonesia time. So the next session is going to be a fireside chat where we're going to be looking at managing spectrum in times of crisis and tools and techniques to keep societies connected. So looking at people's response to COVID-19 and how regulators and industry have worked together to keep societies connected. So looking forward to that. So thank you very much once again to Kondo-san and to all of our panelists. Thank you to you out there. And we'll be back here in around about 35 minutes. Thank you.